Okay, so tonight is Baruch Hashem is we're leaving tonight is today was Tesvav Sivan, the 15th of Sivan. We'll talk about that in a second, the significance, but Rabbi Shimon just reminded me that tonight it's 16th, today already in Yerushalayim is the 16th, is the yard site of our dear friend and member of the University District Minyan, Rabbi Mendy, that passed away unfortunately young a few years ago, and so may his neshama have an aliyah, and he is Zichri Baruch, and he's ready up in Shemaim, and he should daven mispal for his community, and his community is mispal for him, and hopefully someone's going to be saying Kaddish for him as Hashem this over his yard site, and so a chance to say L'chaim, so L'chaim to Beryl, Chaim. I think his father's name is Elchanan. Beryl ben Elchanan, or so. I'll bring it up in a second. So today is also the 15th of the month of Sivan, is a significant day in Chabad calendar, because the 15th of the month of Sivan is the day that the previous Rebbe was arrested. And we know the story. 1927, the previous Lubavitch Rebbe was arrested for his work specifically in Jewish education in the time under the Russian communists. So this was in 1927, just after the revolution against the Tsar. Within a few years, I think 8 years, the Friedrich Rebbe's activities on behalf of Yiddishkeit, and again specifically for Jewish education and from family purity, setting up mikvahs or keeping mikvahs open and setting up groups of people to sit and teach youngsters the Friedrich Rebbe, and not only the previous Rebbe, but others, Chassidim of the previous Rebbe. The famous idea that the previous Rebbe gathered amongst himself 9 Chassidim, with himself was 10, to make a commitment, a bris, a covenant between each other, that they're going to go life or death for the strengthening Jewish education and keeping the institutions of the schools open. The communists' main focus group was to the children. So the children shouldn't be educated in religious studies. So they didn't care if the Friedrich Rebbe would sit and learn and write. That didn't bother them. And maybe even some elder Hasidim to sit and learn, that didn't bother them. But what concerned the communists was that the education of the youth, the next generation. They figured the old generation, they're not going to change, but they wanted to make sure that they could capture the young generation. And the previous Rebbe called in 9 Hasidim, and as the story goes, most of them didn't survive. Most of them were captured in different times over the years for Jewish education and sent off to Siberia or worse, killed. And many Hasidim went through tremendous Mesiras Nefesh. And the previous Rebbe was eventually arrested on the night of the 15th of Sivan, which is today. And he was I believe, in Moscow at the time. He didn't live then. The Chabad Hasidim left the city called Lubavitch already in the time of already in the time. Hello, Dr. Henkin. Hello, already in the time of his father, the Rebbe Rashab. The Rebbe Rashab moved to a city called Rostov, which I believe is south of Russia. And after the Rebbe Rashab passed away in 1920, so Tafresh Pei, his only son, the previous Rebbe, took over activities, eventually moving to, I believe, to Moscow, and he was arrested, if I'm not mistaken, either Moscow or Leningrad. But one of the larger cities. He was arrested, and he was taken into captivity, and it was a very, very dark time for the Jewish people, for Hasidim. They didn't know. Later we found out that that same night that the previous Rebbe was arrested, which means the 15th of Sivan, they rounded up not just the previous Rebbe, but other religious leaders, not only Jewish leaders, but priests, etc., and a majority, if not all of them, besides the previous Rebbe, who for some sort of complication arrested him. The previous Rebbe was the other religious leaders were sentenced to death that same night, taken to firing squad. Sahira Pinchas. So there was literally, it was a situation that was very dire. The previous Rebbe was sentenced to death. We know that. Eventually, with tremendous efforts by Hasidim, which is what we did in our part in this world, and specifically, of course, the miracles that happened. Min Hashemayim, the previous Rebbe was saved. Eventually, first to be sent off to what's called a prolonged exile on the 3rd of Tammuz to a city called Kostroma, and that itself also only lasted about 10 days, and the previous Rebbe was released on the 12th and the 13th of Tammuz, which has become known as a holiday of Geula, of redemption, where it was revealed the redemption of the previous Rebbe. We'll talk more about it when we come to Yud Beis Tammuz. But what I want to emphasize now, before we go into the Parsha, and why it's an important day, we don't find much literature. I mean, we find the story of these few days, the day the previous Rebbe was arrested, the Rebbe, our Rebbe was a Rebbe who was a family member of the previous Rebbe. But aside from that, he was his future son-in-law. He wasn't yet married, but he was engaged to be married to his daughter, the Rebbetzin Chaim Osya. So the Rebbe that night wasn't right there in the house of his future father-in-law when he was arrested. The story goes that he was coming home, and when the police were ransacking the house and taking documents, etc., the Rebbe was making his way back to his future father-in-law's house. The Rebbe's wife to be, the Rebbetzin, was on the porch waiting to see him, and she shouted out, Schneerson, which was obviously the Rebbe's last name, "We have guests." And that was a code for the Rebbe to know that the police had entered the house, and therefore the Rebbe didn't make it home. He ran away, went to the offices with Chaim Lieberman, and they destroyed documents. Again, it was a very, very hard time, and the Rebbe, the previous Rebbe, writes in detail of those few hours and few days right after the arrest, of the torture, literally the physical torture that he went through, both violently and verbally, and how difficult those first few days. So between the 15th of Sivan and then the 3rd of Tammuz, which is a little bit over 2 weeks later, the previous Rebbe was exiled to Kostroma, and again, eventually, not even 10 days later, on the 12th, 13th of Tammuz, the previous Rebbe was released and then eventually was exiled from Russia, spending the next 10 years in different European cities, the Riga, Warsaw, Atwatsk, Poland, and eventually the previous Rebbe, and after the Nazis, first running away from the communists and then dealing with the Nazis, after the Nazis started to invade Europe and invade Poland while the previous Rebbe was there, through, again, tremendous efforts from Hasidim and miracles, the Rebbe was actually, eventually the previous Rebbe was taken through Germany and on a boat to make his way eventually to back to Riga, then to America. And he spent the last 10 years of his life, like it says, Yaakov's Tov, the best years of his life was in Eretz Mitzrayim. The previous Rebbe, though he didn't have many of his Hasidim, the previous Rebbe was a very small group of Hasidim when he made it to America, and he started anew. And eventually, different families and peoples came from the war after the Allies' victory, and then those who made it eventually over the years. It took years for some Hasidim to make it out of Russia. Some people only made it out mamish at the fall of communism in 1990s. But over the years, in the 60s, 50s, 60s, 70s, different groups of people made it out of Russia. And the Rebbe built up the Hasidim again. But the previous Rebbe's final 10 years was in the United States of America, and the kindness, he talks about the kindness of the United States of America, of Medina Shel Chesed, a country of kindness. So we're makar tov to the chsanya, to those who host us. We know that the Torah talks about even places, if we learn a kal v'chomer, even if the Torah tells us that we're supposed to recognize Egypt, that tormented us as an chsanya, as a host. Surely the United States, which was a gracious host to the Rebbe and Hasidim, were makar tov. But the idea that I want to talk about that's connected to this week's parsha, and connected, the Rebbe didn't, our Rebbe, there's not that many Farbrengens on the 15th of Sivan, but actually in 1974, the Rebbe came down Motzei Shabbos Saturday night, and the Rebbe Farbrenged on the 15th of Sivan. He said a mimer on Baloscha, and talked about a little bit about the how we're supposed to view the beginnings of the arrest that led eventually to the redemption of Yud Beis Tammuz. And so basically, there was three times in the previous rabbi's arrest. L'chaim. There was three times in the previous rabbi's arrest. Not the first stage was, like we said, the 15th, when the previous rabbi was arrested, taken into prison that same night. His mother, the Rebbetzin, Stern Sarah, the wife of the Rebbe Rashab, was in panic. Of course, his wife and his daughters. The previous Rebbe only had daughters, and he was taken in. Mamish, horrible treatment that he had that night. They pulled the gun on him. They beat him. They put him for a few days. He was in dung up to his waist. I mean, really, to read the description of what the previous Rebbe went through on behalf of Chassidim, on behalf of Torah and education and Jewish education. I mean, to appreciate today that we have opportunities to send our children to Jewish education, even if it is a bit of expense. But here, the Chassidim and the Rebbe literally put their lives in danger. I mean, the Rebbe was sentenced to death because to preserve Jewish education. And it wasn't for himself. He was able to live as a religious Jew. It was that he was dedicated to make sure that we educate the next generation according to Torah mitzvahs. And so when we analyze the stages, so the first stage is the 15th, is the rest, seemingly a very hard day. And then becomes seemingly kind of a interesting day, which is the 3rd of Tammuz. Why is it called an interesting day? Because on the 3rd of Tammuz, the previous Rebbe was sentenced to 3 years of exile, to live alone, maybe with one or two Chassidim in the city Kostroma. It was definitely better than death, but that wasn't freedom. He was sent off to exile. And then there was the eventual, actual, total liberation on the 15th, on the 3rd of Tammuz. And so this whole story happened under a month. But when the Rebbe would talk about the 3rd of Tammuz, the Rebbe would say that's the beginning of the hidden miracle. Why? Because the 3rd of Tammuz led to the 13th of Tammuz, the 12th of Tammuz. At the time the Hasidim thought it was a harsh punishment, 3 years of exile. They wouldn't be with the Rebbe. But the truth is that was the beginning. That was the miracle happening before we were able to understand it, and that's how Hasidim really understand what it means, the 3rd of Tammuz that we've experienced in 1994. So there's an interesting concept. And when the Rebbe Fabrang in 1974 on about the 15th of Tammuz, he quoted the pasuk that we say that Eis Tzara Hili Yaakov. It's the Torah, the teaching of the Baal Shem Tov, that this is a time of tzara. Tzara means it's a dire situation for the Jewish people. Umimena yivasheya. But we'll get yivasheya from the word Yeshua. We will have salvation from this bad situation. Seemingly, if one understands the verse means to say that the pasuk is saying two things. A person could find themselves in a tzara, a tzara Yaakov. It's a time of tzara. But however, mimena, but you'll have salvation from this bad situation. The Baal Shem Tov teaches that mimena yivasheya means not just that you will have redemption from the situation, but the situation itself is going to be a redemption. Meaning to say that in the difficult situations. So later on we see how it's not that you survived a bad situation. It means the bad situation was a bad situation. There was nothing positive about it. However, though there was nothing positive about it, nevertheless, you have redemption, and you won't fall victim, so to say, or you won't have the dire consequences that you thought you would have, because God will give you salvation. But the Baal Shem Tov teaches umimena yivasheya means that you see how the bad situation itself is the beginning of the redemption. The difficult times we go through in life, at the time it's hard to see it. Really, if you want to analyze, and the Rebbe quoted this pasuk about the 15th of Sivan, that Eis Tzari Yaakov Mimena Yivasheya, that it's a time of tzara for Yaakov, means the Jewish people. We say this pasuk every day in davening before in the morning. So it says the pasuk is quoted in Yeshaya Navi that Eis Tzari Yaakov Mimena Yivasheya. So the seemingly the 15th, the Rebbe is telling us that the salvation, Yud Beis Tammuz, the way Hasidim always looked at a situation that was bad. For instance, the 19th of Kislev, right? So the 19th of Kislev, the Alter Rebbe, the first Rebbe Chabad, was arrested also for his efforts of teaching Hasidus. So it's not that when you have the release, so you're happy and you celebrate, that you're no longer in danger. Because in Torah, we never look at that. We never get back to zero. There's no purpose in a down situation, in a difficult situation, to just get back to where you were initially, because then there was no purpose of it. Why would you go through a tzara? Why would you go through a difficult time just to survive it and get back to where you were before? What did you gain? It's like an investment where you initially thought you lost all your money, and then you find out you got back your money. You got back your original investment. So, but at the end of the day, is you have no return. So if you have no return, so what's the purpose of the investment? So you're happy, oh, Baruch Hashem, I survived, I didn't lose anything. But there was no return on the investment. So too, when a person, a Yid, goes through any situation that a Yid goes through in this world, can't just be to get back when you say, oh, I'm celebrating the Geula, the redemption, that it's not as bad as it could have been. Or we survived it and it's not bad at all. We're back to where we started from. I'm back home. I'm back in my yishul. I'm davening again. I'm teaching chassidus. But then what was the purpose of the whole difficult situation? You have to be able to get an elevation. A yerida has to have tzarach aliyah. When we have a descent, it has to have a purpose of elevation. And same thing over here. Yutes Kislev. That when the Alter Rebbe was arrested on the 19th of Kislev, so he was visited by his teachers, the Baal Shem Tov and the Maggid. When they were already in the afterlife, but they came to visit the Alter Rebbe in his cell. He said, when I get out of prison, what should I do? So they said, you have to teach more. Why do you have to teach more? Because to teach the same, then what was the purpose of the imprisonment? There has to be a benefit. That when you get through a difficult situation, you have to come out stronger, not just stronger to be able to achieve what you once achieved, but stronger to be able to achieve much more than what you achieved. Otherwise, there's no purpose in the difficult situation. And that's what the Baal Shem Tov teaches. A tzara, when there's a tzara, mimena yivasheya, the salvation has to come from the tzara itself, from the difficult time itself. The surviving of the difficult time is not enough. You have to thrive from the difficult time. So therefore, when the Rebbe spoke in 1974 about the 15th of Tammuz, really, the yivasheya, the salvation starts on the 15th. Although we emphasize that the geula, the redemption, started on the 3rd of Tammuz, until it led to the revealed redemption on the 15th of Tammuz. But the salvation, the Yevasheya, needed the tzara. Although at that time it was horrible for the previous Rebbe, and he was beaten, and Chassidim were killed, and it was a very bad situation. Like I said, the previous Rebbe was sentenced to death. That same night, they took out other religious leaders from other faiths to the firing squad, and they murdered, the communists murdered different religious leaders, and the previous Rebbe could have been, unfortunately, on that list. And through miracles he wasn't, but it's not just that we start celebrating the redemption on the 3rd of Tammuz. We see the Yivasheya, the salvation now already on the 15th of Tammuz, on Sivan. And the 15th, the Rebbe talks about is the complete date. That's the Kair Sir B'Ashel Musa. The highest day of the month is the 15th. That's why most holidays are on the 15th. The moon is full on the 15th. The Jewish people are compared to the moon. So it's specifically, the previous Rebbe was arrested. Like Pesach the redemption of Pesach happened on the 15th. The previous Rebbe was arrested on the 15th is a sign that the 15th is a day that this is going to be not just a tzara that we're going to get out of, but it's going to be a yivashay, it's going to be a salvation. It itself is a salvation. The very fact that we're sitting today with shuls and moistas, the nicest Jewish institutions, is today what was once the former Soviet Union, that's all the work of the previous Rebbe from 1920 to 1927, and his fathers and his grandfathers before. So there is the idea of Yeshua that we're already starting to celebrate today on the 15th of Sivan. And also, as our dear friend who's in our class group, Eli, pointed out, that on the 15th of Sivan today is the birthday and the yard site of Yehuda, Ben Avram Yehuda, the tribe, which is from the main of the tribes. The Jewish people today are Yehudim, are Jews, because most of the Jews are from the tribe of Yehuda, and also the avoda of Yehuda, of bittul, of haidah, of acknowledgement, is an avoda of all the Jewish people. All the Jewish people are called after Yehuda, and his birth and his yard site is a day, obviously, that empowers the Jewish people, because the Jewish people come after Yehuda, and especially the leaders of the Jewish people, that we know the leaders of the Jewish people throughout the history were from the tribe of Yehuda, starting from King David and his descendants, the kings of King David and the leaders of the Reish Galuta were all descendants, the house of Hillel, all these old descendants. The Rebbes were descendants of our Rebbe and all the way from the Alter Rebbe to the Maral were all descendants of Yehuda, of David HaMelech. So the yard site and the birthday of our forefather, Yehuda, empowers us to be able to get through this Haidah. Yehuda himself went through challenging times. The Gemara tells us in Sota that Yehuda went through the story of Tamar and the story of Yosef, but he came out. He was a tzaddik. He ended up he was one of the founders of that concept of tshuva, of the mitzvah of tshuva, of repentance. So what does this all have to do with Parshas Behaalotecha? So Parshat Behaalotecha, actually, when we study the Maimorim of Parshat Behaalotecha, Behaalotecha is the first three parshas of Bamidbar are a continuation. The Parsha Bamidbar itself, the first parsha that we read before Shavuos always, is when we count the Jewish people, and we continue to count into the tribe of Levi in the Parsha of Nasai. And then, like we spoke last week, we learn about at the end of Nosau, the dedication of the tabernacle by the princes. And then this week's parsha opens up with Behaalotecha. So we spoke last week about Behaalotecha. Behaalotecha means that Hashem is talking to Aaron HaKohen, Aaron the high priest, that when he lights the candles, it talks about the laws of lighting the candles of the menorah. So what's the connection? Why do we continue from the sacrifices of the dedication of the tabernacle that were done each day for 12 days by the tribes, starting from Yehuda? Again, Yehuda is the main of the tribes. Nachshon and Aminadav was on the first day of Nisan. In the second year, the Jewish people left Mitzrayim, so the dedication of the tabernacle started with Yehuda. But the tribe of Levi doesn't have any representation in the dedication of the tabernacle. So this week, Parsha opens up that the Torah tells us, and in the hidden code of the Torah, the Rashi teaches us that the connection between the lighting of the candles and the dedication of the tabernacle by the princes was that Aaron felt bad as one of the leaders of his tribe. Moshe and Aaron and his sons were Tamar, and these were the ones who were overseeing, and Elazar, the tribe of Levi. He felt there was no representation of his tribe, and he had chulsha daita. He felt weak. He felt uncomfortable. He felt that he was that maybe there was something wrong with his tribe, that they didn't have the ability and the opportunity to dedicate the tabernacle. And Rashi says that God tells Aaron, "Don't feel bad. Shlcha gadol mishalhem." Lighting the menorah is greater. There's all kind of mefarshim that teach us what does it mean lighting the menorah is greater. So the Ramban says, because it's referring to the candles of Hanukkah, that the candles of Hanukkah last even in the exile, while the temple, which was dedicated by the princes, only lasts as long as the temple is standing. We do sacrifices. But today we don't do sacrifices, but we still light the menorah. When everyone lights the menorah in their house, and today all over in public places, we light the Hanukkah menorah. So that's shlecha, that's what the Rambam says, yours is greater than the menorah is greater than the dedication of the sacrifices. But also in Chassidus it explains not just greater because it lasts longer, like the Ramban says, but also in quality. The sacrifices is as high as a person could reach in their self. Yesh Misha Oyev, someone who loves Hashem. We learned this Maimer in the Likutei Torah this week, that the Nesiim, by bringing the sacrifices, they're able to elevate the material to the highest level of material as you remain something separate. For instance, you have your own interests, your own negiyas, your own agenda. So the highest way of keeping your agenda, but so to say aligning your agenda with God's agenda, while you still have your own agenda, is what the princes were able to elevate through the sacrifices. When God tells Aaron, Shlecha, your light, the light of the menorah, is greater than the sacrifices, is also the quality that the Jewish people could reach. The light of the menorah represents the shemen, the level that a person could elevate themselves to total dedication to God. What's called bitul atzmi, that you totally nullify. That's not that your agenda is aligned with God, but your agenda is God's. God's agenda is your agenda. You have no private agenda of your own. Even though you go out to the world and you make parnasa and you make living and you daven and you build a family and you're part of a community and a shul, that's all the agenda of Hashem of making it. It's all focused on of making a dir b'tachton and making a resting place for Hashem. Everything you see is how you could further the Hashem's interest in bringing light, the light of the menorah, to all parts of the world, and the Haftorah. So we go through this week's parsha. That's just the opening part of the Torah. From there, we learn so many things in the Torah. We continue with the counting of the Levites. We get the tribes ready for travel. We learn the famous. This week's Torah is actually very interesting because it's brought down that there's a certain verse that we start off, the sixth reading called Vayhi Mitzvah Aaron. We all know that. That's the prayer we say when we open the ark every day. Every time we open the ark, before we take the Sefer Torah, before we take the Torah out, everyone knows we sing Vayhi Mitzvah Aaron. We open the ark after the first morning prayer, and we read the Torah. So those few verses, Vayhi Mitzvah Aaron, when the ark traveled. So there's a symbol. In the Torah there's a symbol of two nuns, and that symbol symbolizes that it's as if it's its own book. The Torah goes through, although we all know that there's the 5 books of Moses, there's a concept of the 7 books of Moses. How's there 7? Because the fourth book, which is the book of Bamidbar that we're in, has within it a book. And so therefore there's the book of Vayhi ben Sa'ar, and it's its own book. And therefore there's the first part of the book. There's the middle little few verses, which is Vayhi ben Sa'ar. The second part, so Bamidbar is really three books. So if you count the 3 books plus the other remaining 4 books, which is Bereshis, Shmos, Vayikra, and Devarim, you have 7 books of the Torah. So in this week's parsha, we actually cover 3 of the 7 books. So we have another part of the Torah. That's the part of the Torah that talks about the traveling. And then we finish off the last 2 readings of this week's parsha. We actually start to learn about what happened to the Jewish people after the travels and the moving of the Aron and the moving of the Ark and the moving of the Mishkan. So the last 2 we talk about, it's not our finest moment. The test of the Misainim, the complaining about they say that the Jewish people ran from Matan Torah like a child runs out of cheder, right? When you run out of school. This week everyone's graduating, getting ready to finish their school year. So I remember I once picked up my children. I was in the MMSC then in Seattle. We picked up our children the last day. They were all waiting by the door, and they burst out as they ran out of school for the final time they left that year. So it says like a Yeled Baruch Beis HaSefer. The Jewish people left Matan Torah like the kids run out of school on the final day. They were excited. They ran away. Enough. Too much spirituality. We sat by the mountain for almost a year. They say the Jewish people start to travel on the 20th of Iyar. They received the Torah on the 6th of Sivan. So on the 20th of Iyar, 6th of Sivan in the first year, right? We left Egypt on the 15th of Nisan. We traveled, we counted the 49 days of the Omer. The 50th day we received the Torah, which was the 6th of Sivan. And then we remained by Har Sinai, that we had the golden calf. We learned about the Mishkan. We built the Mishkan. And when did the Jewish people start to travel? Hopefully to go right away into Eretz Yisrael, if not for our sins, was on the 20th of Iyar. And it says, the Jewish people ran from Har Sinai like a child runs from school, right? Har Sinai, they felt too intense. Every day they had another shiur. They had to learn about the Mishkan. They learned Torah every day. They wanted it's time to go. That was already the negative things. And we learned about the Jewish people complained. They weren't happy with the man. They felt the man wasn't good enough. They wanted food. They wanted meat. And we learned about Moshe feels that he needs help. He says, I'm alone. God tells him to appoint the 70 elders. We have the Eldad, the Modad, already starting to prophesy Moshe is not going into the land. And we have the end of the parsha. It's not either such a pretty story. The story of Miriam talking about her younger brother. She doesn't approve of everything Moshe does. And God is not happy with Aaron, and Aaron listens to Miriam. Miriam says it. Miriam is struck with leprosy. So we really talk about, we'll get to the details a little bit in a second. What we talk about in this week's parsha about the menorah is a very small part. The menorah is mamash, a very small part of the parsha. When we open up the Haftorah, and we say, what is the Haftorah? The Haftorah is the part that we read from the prophets after the reading, which started in Roman times when there was a decree against studying Torah, so the Jewish people instituted the idea of reading from the prophets. But that became part of everyone knows the Haftorah, right? The bar mitzvah boy reads the Haftorah. So the Haftorah of this week's parsha, there's so many large stories in this week's parsha. Not all of them may be pretty, but they're large stories. The menorah is a very small part. And what is the Haftorah of this week's parsha? The Haftorah of Zechariah. That Zechariah prophesizes. And where does he prophesy? He prophesizes in Babylonia, meaning after the destruction of the first temple. When the Jewish people are in Golus, in exile, he prophesizes about Menorah Zav Tar. He prophesizes about the pure gold menorah. In the times of Zerubbabel. Zerubbabel was what happened when the Jewish people was, for a quick history, the first temple was of course built by Solomon, the son of David, and the house of David ruled over the tribe of Judah. Again, this is Judah's yahrzeit today. It's Yehuda, and today so the first 10 tribes after the life of Solomon, Yeravim, the son of Nevat, led a rebellion, so to say, against King Solomon, based on the prophecy of Achia Shaloni, which was a great prophet. He himself was a whole story connected to Mashiach, connected to Moshe. Achia Shaloni is one of those prophets who never died. The Gemara tells us itself. The Gemara tells us that Achia Hashiloni, who's the prophet, he saw Moshe Rabbeinu. Not just the Gemara tells us, but the Rambam. When the Rambam quotes in Halacha, in the book of laws, like the Rebbe always would say, the Rambam is not a book of history at all. So if the Rambam says anything that has a historic significance, we have to find the law part of it, because he's a book of laws. And in his tradition of Torah, he quotes how Achia Shaloni receives from King David, although the Rambam writes he left Egypt. It means he was much older than David. The Rambam says he saw Moshe. He was a young boy under Moshe. But he doesn't come to his full form until after King David becomes king, and he's in the chain of tradition of Torah. He receives from David. And Achia Shaloni is the prophet in the days of Solomon, and he admonishes Solomon for some of the things Solomon did after he built the temple, and he splits the 10 tribes away from the house of David, what was known as the kingdom of the north, called Yisrael, and the kings of Yisrael were all horrible kings, eventually to be exiled 100 years prior to the destruction of the first temple. And that's what we know as the 10 lost tribes. So what we have remaining today is the tribe of Yehuda, the Levites, and those who made their way down south in the years that they weren't happy living in the north that wasn't godly, and they wanted to be in the temple. So there could be some people today that are part of the other tribes, but the people are the Jews, are the Yehudim from Yehuda. But King David, when at the end of the first temple, the kings of King David also weren't so great. And they had the prophecies, the prophecy of Yeshaya, Navi, Isaiah, we had Jeremiah, and then we had the destruction of the temple. But before the destruction of the temple, 20 so years before the destruction of the temple, the first king of Yehuda was already taken into exile, with some of the people from the house of David and from the Jewish people that lived in Jerusalem. They were taken into exile initially into Babylonia, today around the Iraq-Iran area, and the king was Yechoniah. And he had a descendant, a son or a grandson called Zerubbabel. And after the destruction of the first temple, and the rest of the Jews were exiled to meet their brethren in Babylonia under the Babylonians. So the leadership stayed in the house of David, although they weren't kings, but they were what's called the Rosh Galusa. They were the leaders in exile. And who is the leader in exile in the time of this prophecy? Is Zerubbabel. His name was Zerubbabel, descendant of the house of David. And the prophecy is about Zerubbabel and the menorah. And the Gemara teaches us, and the Medrash teaches us, that Zechariah's prophecies, while Yeshaya and the other prophets, and especially Yirmiyahu, spoke negative, said to the Jewish people, you're like the bad alloys in silver. Zechariah talks and says positive. Says Kula Zav Tar, you're all gold, pure gold. Even though they're in Galus, in exile, and even though our sins brought us into exile. But he saw the positive. And in Chassidus it explains that the name Zerubbabel is made up of two words. Zerua is from the word Zareya, to plant. Planting in Bavel. What does it mean, planting in Bavel? That the planting of the seeds of redemption happens in Bavel. Again, we don't look at Galus, we don't look at exile as a negative thing. Exile is a positive thing. I mean, not positive means it's obviously negative because we're not building, but there is positive in Galus. What's the positive? To get to true Geula, redemption. To get to Mashiach, there has to be the Yerida. And specifically in the difficult times is Zerubbabel, in Bavel, in Babylonia. So there's the prophecy of Zechariah that we read in the Haftarah of Kulei Zav, your old gold, your menorah Miksha Zav. He's talking about the Jewish people. The menorah represents the Jewish people. Yes, there's different parts of the menorah, the 7 types of Jews, and it could be there's some bad, but the Rebbe says you don't know who's good, who's bad, who's being elevated by the next person, who's bringing down the next person. But as a whole, you're Kulei Zav, Tahar. And the idea of Zerubbabel is that in Bavel, in exile, You have to be zayreh, you have to plant, because what's going to, just like when you plant a seed, you don't hope to get the seed back. Like we just spoke before, the idea is you invest the efforts of planting a seed, because the seed is going to yield much more than the investment. You can have tons of wheat from one seed. So too, Zerubbabel in the exile, through the challenges of Galus, we get only to Geula. And like the Alter Rebbe said, the idea that the Rebbe spoke about the final years, the Alter Rebbe talks about in this idea of Zerubbabel, that the difference between Geula and Goyla, the difference between redemption and exile is Aleph. When you find the Aleph, Aleph is the oneness of God, Hashem Echad, Alufay Shel Olam. When you find the oneness of Hashem in difficult times, you're able to go from Galus and you find the Geula, the redemption. And this is why it's the Rebbe spoke in 1974, when he spoke about that although the 15th of Sivan was in the Jewish history of Chabad, was a horrible day, the day the previous Rebbe was arrested, and he went through difficult times. The previous Rebbe himself, not just Chassidim, himself, he was physically tortured and uncertain of his outcome. The previous Rebbe says that he had to dig in so deep to his, and this is a Rebbe talking, to his core to get through these difficult times. He remembered that in the 6 months before, he said a mimer on Rosh Hashanah, that he talked about Hashgacha Pratis, he talked about the Baim province, and he didn't know why he said something about that. He said something, he didn't know why he said it. And only when he went through the difficult first moments of the imprisonment on the 15th of Sivan in 1927, he realized that he was drawing energy from speaking about divine providence. There must be something positive here. The previous Rebbe writes in the initial moments of his arrest, he said he started to think that he really started to get negative, that really he felt uncomfortable. And then when he said, how could I be falling apart? My family, the Chassidim depend on me. And who do I depend on? I depend on God. So I have to make sure that we get out of this situation. And he screams out, Abba, Abba, Hatzileini, my father, take me out of this situation. So it was very dire times. But in the 15th, in that day, is Zerubbabel, comes the Geula of Yud Beis Tammuz, Yud Gimel Tammuz. And that's why, although we learned so much about in this week's Parsha, we learn about the story, the end of the Parsha is not necessarily a happy Parsha. This is one of the few times in the Torah that the Balkora, the one who reads the Torah, the tradition is to lower your voice. What does lowering our voice in reading the Torah signify? That means that it's not a pretty story to read about, right? We read loud about something we're proud. It's not our proudest moment. It's not our finest moment. So we read it a bit lower. And we read about it in the times of the egel, of the golden calf. And in this week's parsha, we also read louder. The Jewish people start to complain. It's not our finest moment. And the parsha doesn't finish off necessarily in our finest moment. The next week's parsha is not our finest moment. The story of the spies and Korach is not our finest moment. But when we start the story of Bamidbar, where how Bamidbar turns from the counting of the Jewish people, and we start learning about the journey of the desert, the 42 journeys of our life, the Misbar Membeis. We learned in the Gemara, and finish off with this idea. We learned in the Gemara yesterday an amazing thing that the Gemara says that we learn that how do we know that that a person that a person should always occupy themselves in Torah mitzvahs even for the wrong intent, even if you don't have the right intent. It means for the sake of God. There's different levels of the wrong or not the right intent. But why? So a person may say, okay, if I don't have the right intent, I won't do Torah until I'm ready to do Torah properly. The Gemara says no, that you should do it shalol lishma because you eventually get to lishma. Like Chassidus says, shemitoich, just like mimemeni yivasheya, from the negative intent, you'll get to the positive intent. And where's the proof? The Gemara brings a proof from a story later on in Bamidbar, that Balak, when the end of the Jewish people's travels in the desert, and they're about to go into Eretz Yisrael, and Balak commissions the Bilham to curse the Jewish people. So he sets up 42 sacrifices, the Gemara says. 3 times 7 times 2, because he brought every time he had 7 cows and 7 rams, and he did it 3 times, is 42. And because he sacrificed 42 sacrifices to gods, although his intention was totally negative, he wanted to bring destruction on the Jewish people. God was not happy with him. But nevertheless, he did sacrifices. And because of that, he was blessed. And what was his blessing? His great-granddaughter is Ruth, who we read about in Shavuos. Ruth, the convert, who's with the story of Naomi, who marries his Boaz, is the daughter of Eglon, the king of Moab, and Eglon is the grandson of Balak. And who's Ruth? Ruth is the mother of David, the grandmother of David, the grandmother of Mashiach. So what do we see from all this? That the 42 cows sacrifices that he sacrificed correspond to the 42 travels of the Jewish people in the desert. That not always is everything. There's something that negative. There's positive. Many vashaya. In the darkest of times, Zru Bavel. In Bavel, you find the beginning of the salvation. And that's why, as much as the Torah continues off in other stories, when the Haftorah wants to tell us the story of this week's Parsha in a nutshell, it says the story of this week's Parsha is the story of Zechariah. That in Bavel, yes, there's negative times, things can happen that are not great, but in Bavel, that's where you're the golden menorah. He doesn't subscribe to what Yirmiyahu says that you're a bad alloy. He doesn't you're bad alloys in the silver. He says, Kulei Zav, yes, and there's difficult times, and we don't always make the right choices, and we ended up in Bavel for our own sins. But in there, we're going to be many of Hashem. From there, we're going to find the salvation. The 15th of Siva may be the day the previous Rebbe was arrested. But from here starts the Geula, the redemption, may be Zeicha. That the Jewish people now are Eisar Hil Yaakov. Not sure people realize what's going on in Eretz Yisrael and the threats that Eretz Yisrael is facing. We take for granted miracles, but we shouldn't take for granted. We have to hope for miracles, but we have to daven. But we Eisar Hil Yaakov, many of Hashem, we should find the salvation with the coming of Mashiach. It should lead speedily, not even wait till Gimel Tammuz, Yibis Tammuz immediately. We should celebrate with the coming of Mashiach, the Geula Mitzvah Vashlema. I want to wish everyone a good Shabbos. I think Matthew and Goldie are still out of town, so he was supposed to be by me last Shabbos. It didn't end up working out, but I would like to wish everyone a good Shabbos and follow up with Reb Shimon on your WhatsApp groups about information about the Minyan this week. And I'm sure there's a Minyan. Try to attend and be mechazik if less people are around. And we'll see you.